Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. It's really good to be back with you again. I'm back with a really dear friend and colleague, Fiorella Isabel, who seems to be in a much warmer part of the world than Lebanon at the moment.
Definitely.
What can I say? I mean, there's so much going on. There's conflicts and potential conflicts and rifts and divisions and schisms and everything that's been happening in Iran for the last few days, since, in fact, almost immediately after the kidnapping of President Maduro from Venezuela. We had the outbreak of Mossad, CIA, MI6 engineered riots in Iran that have led to the death of, I think, more than 2,500 Iranian civilians, many of whom were murdered in the most horrific ways, whether it's through snipers on roofs, which of course is a common tactic or strategy of the intelligence complex in the West and in Israel. And nurses and doctors attacked in the clinics, and the most incredible amount of damage to infrastructure over a very short period of time. And of course, the fact that, funnily enough, all of the rioters went home after Starlink was disabled, which is another indication, of course, that Starlink was being used to effectively orchestrate the riots and also then to manage them from a distance. So to a degree, I do think Iran is reeling from the violence that they've witnessed across many of its cities and regions for a number of days. We're obviously seeing Trump build up military hardware in the region. Somebody was telling me today that there are now 2 aircraft carriers in the region. He believes, with his various contacts talking to him in the US, that there is it's necessary for a 3rd aircraft carrier to join them in order to sustain a US bombing campaign for more than 72 hours. I bow to his superior knowledge. And that certainly seems to be the way that we're heading. We know through various reports and intel that Israel's task, if Iran is attacked, is to basically keep the resistance factions in this region busy, which means, of course, Lebanon. And we're seeing a massive escalation even in Lebanon, not only in the south, but heading north into the northeastern border with Syria. We've seen the release of ISIS by the US, Israeli backed and Turkish backed Jolani forces, terrorist forces in the northeast of Syria. And the US is effectively right now transferring ISIS elements from the northeast into Iraq. So it looks very much as if ISIS is going to be weaponized against the Iraqi resistance there as part of this campaign against Iran. I had a conversation with the foreign minister of the Sana'a government, so the Ansarullah coalition government, last Sunday, so we can talk about that also during our conversation. But it looks very much as if Iran and Yemen, the 2, will be heavily targeted in this attack. So from this region, that's what's going on. There's very much a kind of an escalation, a buildup of tension. As someone said to me yesterday, it's a given that there is going to be an aggression against Iran, and to an extent, we're living on borrowed time. It should have already happened, but for some reason they've delayed, probably for Israel to prepare better and for the US to move everything into place. And perhaps they expected that the riots would go on for longer. They didn't expect Iran to be able to shut down Starlink, et cetera, et cetera. There's always kind of modifications to plans, particularly when the consequences are potentially going to be enormous. Not only for Iran and Yemen and the region, but also for US bases in the region. One reason why, of course, they withdrew all forces to Iraqi Kurdistan, and they evacuated all the other bases in Iraq. And also among the Zionist bloc states like UAE, Saudi Arabia, even Qatar and so on may well come under attack. And so that's going to affect oil supply, even to countries like China. What are China and Russia going to do in the event of war? And we can talk about this. I mean, there's been the usual ridiculous posts on X talking about X number of Chinese planes landing in Tehran in the last few days and so on, which is complete nonsense. I mean, it's been completely sort of declared fake news by Iranian commentators on X, and even Grok. And I hate to actually deploy Grok, but on this kind of information, they're generally not bad because it's black and white, factual information. And they basically said, look, nothing concurs with this theory. So just as with Venezuela, we're seeing the usual ramping up of Russia and China are going to come to the rescue. But in my opinion, the reality is that Iran is very much on its own, apart from some advisory role by Russia, and I would say even less so from China, but I'd be interested in your view. And then, of course, everything that's going on in Latin America, which we can also talk about, and Bob, Trump's board of peace on Gaza. Sophie, it's really good to be back with you. It's been a little while.
Yeah.
And everything just seems to escalate.
Yeah, forgive us. It's been already from the get-go a trying new year. I mean, right now I'm in South America, I'm in Peru, and from the moment I arrived, it was basically the year wasn't over, and then we got the kidnapping of Maduro, and then from then on we went into just overdrive of US foreign policy catastrophe under the Trump administration. But let's not forget, it's obviously Trump is just the face. What we're talking about here is a deeply planned, long planned military intelligence apparatus against pretty much any resistance and actual anti-imperialist factions that are existing right now. This is why we said from the beginning that after Venezuela, Iran was going to be targeted. This is why we said years ago, now at this point, that with a Trump presidency, we would get a refocusing on Latin America and on West Asia, because that's what Trump's role is, and that's exactly what he's doing. He's expanding also, of course, Zionist. Israel, the Zionism is actually like on turbo speed right now. And everything that Vanessa just mentioned, I think it's important to know how quickly they're moving, how rapidly, actually, in spite of their delays, how rapidly they're targeting each specific target, very specific targets, from Venezuela to Iran to Yemen. I mean, this is, I think, part of a larger plan that definitely involves the Zionist bloc, as we talked about in recent shows before. And I think obviously it's nothing new with the attacks on Iran using this idea of human rights violations. None of that, all of that is whatever. This is what they've done forever. But what's actually, I think, more dangerous now is the fact that they're so overtly doing it, and the fact that we have come past the point of no return with Gaza, and that they're trying to create this narrative of Trump being an actual peace president by having this board of Gaza, this it's actually this board of peace for Gaza, which is insane to even consider that, based on what's happened under Trump and even under Biden. I mean, under the US foreign policy dictate, how to even call it that with Jared Kushner, with Zionists being in charge of this, is an insult to humanity. But what can we expect after Gaza and after nothing's been done? And I do want to definitely touch on that, but I want to ask you, Vanessa, a lot of the reactions I've seen after Venezuela, after the kidnapping of Maduro, in terms coming from Iran, have been quite rather, there's been a sort of arrogance to it. And I did want to talk about this because I think it's very dangerous, and it doesn't help to be rather arrogant and say, well, Iran isn't Venezuela. We know Iran isn't Venezuela. We know Venezuela isn't Syria. We know that there are differences between these countries and these these government structures that got taken down. We know that it's not exactly the same, but what we need to understand here is that they are all fighting the same enemy. And it's part of the same entity that seeks to destroy them. So I think that in spite of Iran's strength, in spite of Iran's years and decades and preparations, no one is too big to fall. We've seen what the United States is doing, and this also touches on our conversation with That Beat Media that we had. I don't think the United States empire is crumbling in the sense of what they're doing to people. What they're doing, they're literally going one by one and taking them down. That's what I'm seeing. I don't know what other people are seeing, but that's literally what is happening, whether we like it or not. Obviously, I don't like it, but that's what is happening. And I think we need to be a little bit more humble and reassess like what is happening. I don't want to be negative and say there's no hope, because I think there is hope, because now I see more people becoming aware of what actual multipolarity means for the world. I see more people becoming aware of what's actually in front of them. But at the same time, I do think that there's a certain kind of I guess arrogance is the word. There's another word for it that is escaping me, but where there's this disbelief that this won't happen, and I think people need to be prepared because of the fact that this has been happening to pretty much everybody, and they know who their targets are, and they haven't stopped. So I believe in the ability of resistance. I believe in the pushback. What I don't like to see is this idea that, oh, we're above it. This isn't going to happen to us. You're all fighting the same entity. So I find that really odd. So just your comments on that, and then yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the classic example is the Russian foreign ministry literally leaning back and crossing their arms and kind of saying, well, we'll just see what happens between the US and the EU over Greenland, when in reality it's a direct threat to Russia's Arctic sphere of influence, right? And even I posted on my Telegram channel like only a few hours ago, the foreign ministry's reaction. So first of all, when Trump boarded the vessel in the Venezuelan waters, shortly after Maduro's kidnap, and there are I think 2 Russian crew members on board. And the foreign ministry, first of all, was kind of, this is piracy, this is violation of international law. And then Maria Zakharova, who's the major spokesperson for the foreign ministry, was literally thanking Trump for agreeing to release the Russian crew members, right? And then suddenly today I saw on TASS, well, she's bewildered now. Trump hasn't followed through on his promise to release the 2 members, and they are basically still being detained, along with a number of Indian and other nationality crew members, right? So what you're talking about here is a kind of, I don't know if it's a complacency or a naivety or this continued belief that they're negotiating with an honest broker in Trump, because I don't, I totally dismiss any kind of 5D nonsense. Let me make that really clear straight away, right? And so that's from a kind of a Russia perspective. I mean, if you're going to be, if your entire sphere of influence, like in the Arctic, where Russia is the leading player, right? It's developed all the equipment, all of the naval capabilities, submarine capabilities, and so on. Is it going to be complacent and just say, well, no one's going to catch up with us, so we can just lean back and see what happens? And in fact, we've even got a case of President Putin literally justifying Trump's or the US's historical claim to Greenland. And to a degree, this is a lack of proactivity that we've seen consistently from Russia, right? And then let's look at Iran. I think, to be fair, a lot of the kind of slightly arrogant comparisons between Iran and Venezuela or Iran and Syria are coming from what I would say Telegram channels, social media accounts that are probably very young, very nationalistic, very patriotic, and to a degree they should be. You know, they should have this unshakable belief in their leadership and so on. But I would hope at the decision-making level, at a military level, they're very well aware of the threats. But I mean, we don't usually get to hear from those people, right? Generally speaking. But yes, there is. And of course, my point always is Iran is a huge country anyway, but that is one of its strengths. It's also one of its weaknesses because it has huge borders, right, with states that could be seen as openly hostile or the potential to be weaponized against Iran now or in the future. Syria falling, I mean, Syria has been subjected to 75 years of CIA MI6 activity. It's falling as part, like, I guess my point is, why are we looking at it as separate states? We've gone beyond Sykes-Picot. We should be looking at the resistance axis as one axis.
Yeah.
One spine. So if one vertebrae is taken out of that spine, even if it's smaller or it's more damaged than the rest of the spine, it's still integral to the spine and it's still incredibly important to the function of that spine. And so therefore there shouldn't be this disconnection from the other members of the resistance axis. And I do see it in quite a lot of commentary, you're right. And I do try and push back against it because the one thing that resistance peoples, factions, states should be doing right now is ensuring unity and ensuring cohesive policy and cohesive strategy, just as the enemy does, even if they fall out. Like, I don't even really believe in the rift between the EU and the US over Greenland. I don't actually. It's kind of, it's theater again. It's like the rift between Trump and Netanyahu. Ultimately, those that are in control, which are more likely the transnational moneyed class, the billionaires, the corporatocracy, are going to be heading in the same direction with some degree of contention over agendas, over strategy, over tactics, and so on. But ultimately, they will be coherent in their policy. I don't know, you know, I'd like to get your views on that.
Yeah, so I quite agree with you, and I think even more this idea that, you know, China and Russia are going to come to the rescue. I wish that was true. That's actually what you do need. You do need a counter, an actual counter to what is going on. But the problem is that that counter pretty much just remains in West Asia, in parts of Latin America, the parts that are essentially under attack, an actual counter to this hegemony. Whereas Russia and China are acting more so as pragmatists that are going to do what's beneficial to them, and we'll see what happens. We'll see if this works in our favor or not. We'll fence it. We'll, you know, work with whoever, but we don't want to like pick a side because, you know, ultimately we don't want to be on the losing side. And it's just, it's very pragmatic, yes, but the people are still under this belief that there's this hegemonic war between the East, including Russia and China and the West. And it's not like that. As we talked about before, this is becoming more about international, transactional, capitalist global class. And that's everything you're seeing now points to that. And I want to comment on the Greenland thing because it's not just Russia. It's literally everybody in Russia's like radar. It's literally a lot of even pro-China accounts. It's a lot of people that are supposedly anti-imperialists that are somehow justifying what the United States is doing to Greenland because they don't like the EU. And the EU is obviously a weakened bloc right now. I mean, they are, but they're also weakened because the United States wanted it that way. If we recall back, Victoria Nuland said, F the EU. They use the EU, they've used NATO to promote this proxy war in Ukraine. So of course this is going to be what they go to as this whole feud that they're playing along with. But the reality is everything the EU does, everything Ukraine does, all of that, the United States knows about it. There's no like, oh, we didn't know, we're gonna just brush it aside. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it like these are separate entities, but it's not the case. We know who's actually behind the scenes and who's pulling the strings, and we know that there is a lack of respect now for the EU because they're weakened, and Donald Trump has been really pushing on that, and also against the UK as well. And we have seen this camaraderie build between China and the Trump administration based on just mocking constantly the EU, the UK, saying that they're the problem, that the United States and Trump are ready to bring peace, but it's just the EU that's the problem. It's just NATO, and they're I've been seeing this on social media for months now, and it's very obvious what's happening here. But I don't understand how people buy that, and it's not just naivety when it comes to Russia. It's actual belief, and policy structure. A lot of analysts, and I'll still fight with people till right now, a lot of analysts on Russia will tell you that Russia doesn't want to end the war, that they want to keep fighting. And that's just not that's not the reality. They want a negotiation deal with the United States. They are literally bending over backwards for this to happen, literally. And the fact that they haven't acted out against what the United States is doing, the fact that they're allowing them to get away with everything they're getting away, is actually pissing some people off within Russia. It's pissing a lot of people in the military. There are other sectors in Russia and other opinions that are like, why are you allowing Trump to just get away with everything? This is again not monolithic thought, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Kremlin clearly are tasked to find a negotiation with the United States. This is why Kirill Dmitriev is out there constantly tweeting, constantly talking about peace with Trump, constantly having these meetings. And this is why they've been talking about the Arctic since at least February of last year. It's literally been almost a year since they've been talking about doing business deals with the United States in the Arctic, which is why they're not pushing back against that, because they actually think that they will have a legitimate business deal with the United States. The problem is, and this is naivety, is that the United States will never look at them as equal. And yet parts of Moscow, and I will say Moscow specifically, because just like in pretty much every other country that I've been to, in the capital, you will have the business class, you will have the elite, you will have the people that are trying to really always look to Europe in Moscow. They feel more European than like Russian, because Russia's so vast, and that's also its strength and its weakness. Because it's so vast that it has multiple territories filled with multiple ethnicities, with multiple needs, and it's so centralized that it hasn't been able to decentralize its vectors of power. And so you have a lot of different needs and different thoughts across areas that are far from Moscow that differ from what Moscow decides. And so what you're seeing here is a growing divisiveness within the Russian people as to what's happening and why. There's a tiredness with the war. There's inflation. These are things that are happening in Russia that people are simply just not talking about outside of, those outside of Russia. They're not talking about that. And that is an area for exploitation. We know that Washington loves to exploit when this happens. However, it is happening. And the reality is Russia is looking, if you are being honest, quite weak right now with how they're reacting to the United States. And it everything that they're doing in action shows that they want to negotiate, they want to end this war, and that they're willing to do it. Now, when it comes to opposition to that, of course there is opposition to that. There are people in Russia who think that Kirill Dmitriev is a fifth columnist who is embedded, of course, to every corporate sector in the United States. There are people who see what Russia is doing and sort of backing down with the many violations the United States has done, and not just the United States, but their directing of Ukraine, their lack of just seemingly respect, and that's not going to change. And the only way that would change is if the United States has captured Russia in one way or feels content with what they're doing. Now, again, we look at Venezuela, right, and how Delcy Rodriguez is acting with Donald Trump, how she met with the director of the CIA, how there's been a change in different positions, but you still have the Chavistas in power, and you have the number one ask of the Venezuelan people is to bring back Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. And so that's their number one ask. Venezuela's in a more vulnerable position in terms of what they're doing, because the United States, as we all know, considers it its backyard. They've always had a relationship with the United States culturally as well as economically. And, we may not like what we're seeing. We may not, we may think this is ludicrous. They kidnapped your president. You're meeting with the CIA. What is going on here? But the reality is that that's the world we live in right now. What is Venezuela expected to do under the circumstances? Russia, however, has a different position where they could actually, and along with China, do more. And they could actually do the many very things that a lot of these people online on YouTube say, oh, they're fighting the US hegemonic imperialist warmongers. They could actually do that, but they're choosing not to. And I do think that there's a lot of strength given to Russia and idealisms given to Russia that were never theirs or are no longer theirs. And this is why some have described Russia as a paper tiger, right? With like a lot of bravado, but actually when you look at their actions, they're not responding according to their words.
Yeah. And I think the perfect example of that is Greenland, and the statement from Putin, where he effectively historically justifies what Trump is doing and kind of says something along the lines of, well, yeah, but, Denmark treats Greenland like a colony, as if any of them are going to care about the indigenous people's rights in Greenland. They're just focused on the resources, on the integration into, what is it, the 1940s technate, which includes, of course, and that's where Venezuela comes in, because it comprises Greenland, Venezuela, and then some of the like Bermuda, French Guyana, etc. And that's effectively, if people want to look that up, it was 1933 concept from what was known then as Technocracy Incorporated, and they created the technate, which is the map of U.S. Basically defensive influence, right? Which is now what is being created by Trump, if you look at what he's doing, right? And if you look at, how can Russia justify that? I mean, don't they have some kind of historical analysts working within the advisory board around Putin that are saying to him, actually, perhaps we should be a bit careful about, effectively endorsing this? This is the problem. And this is what I see so often with heads of state. The same thing to a degree happened in Syria, I think, from 2018 onwards. The advisors that came in around President Assad were either leaning towards the Gulf states under Russian influence, or leaning towards the West and compromise and, creating a democracy and so on. And honestly, I think that was part of the destructive process of the centralized governance in Syria. And unfortunately, and this is just my own speculation, looking at what's going on, I'm seeing almost the same thing happening in Russia. And of course, how old is President Putin now? Of course, we're also ending.
70.
Yeah, we're reaching. Presumably he will have a long life and so on. But actually, one of his speeches, I think I sent it to you. He didn't sound. He sounded very breathless. He sounded very unusually sort of not in control of what he was saying. It was quite odd. I picked up on it. Perhaps it was just a sort of, a one instant thing. But I am seeing that very clearly, both in the policy, which really began to disintegrate after the fall of Syria, and even before the fall of Syria during the last 5 years. I know we've kind of talked about this many times, how Russia's policy seemed to pivot more and more towards particularly protecting the security of Israel, which is why they stood down whenever there were strikes against Iranian officials or against resistance like Hezbollah, Lebanese resistance inside Syria. And certainly the resistance here are pretty resentful towards Russia for having effectively allowed the assassination of their fighters, who were presumably fighting on the same side as Russia to maintain Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but who were allowed to be assassinated without any intervention by Russia to defend or to protect them, right? Or even to inform them of incoming strikes, because they were given prior warning by Israel, okay, with relatively short time window, but they were given prior warning. And then when you look at Putin's statement, for example, on the Board of Peace, and again, people are disseminating it and going, see, he supports Palestinian rights, because he basically says, I'm only going to join a peace board if it takes into account Palestinian rights. And I can't remember his exact wording, but I'm like, you've done nothing to support Palestine other than to make statements about a two-state solution, which we know was dead in the water back in 1936. You've done nothing to boycott Israel, boycott the Zionist bloc, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all of which is supporting Israel and has continued supporting Israel throughout the intensified genocide since October the 7th. So this, for me, are just meaningless phrases, very much like their belligerence when America does something, Trump does something, and then they cave and they effectively make concessions to America, despite the fact that America is doing damage to Russia and it's building up pressure on Russia. And yet they seem to be constantly caving and not militarily or even politically backing up their rhetoric. Right. And at the same time, I do think, and we've talked about this, there is division, of course, as you've said, in Russia itself, even within the Kremlin, even within the military, even within the UN, because Vasily Nebenzia is very strong in his statements, both about Venezuela and about Gaza. Right. So I do think that there is a schism also within the ruling class in Russia over what's going on. And many of them don't want to head back towards some kind of subservient alliance with the United States, because it's never going to be anything other than that, right? And if you come back to the Board of Peace, Putin made the statement, okay, take the money from the money that was stolen from us, the $5 billion that's basically banked in the United States, and we'll contribute $1 billion to give us preferential membership to the Board of Peace. And people were saying, oh, but he's being ironic and blah blah blah, this is Putin, he's a genius, etc. No, because the meeting in Moscow last night included Gaza, right? And who have they now brought in alongside Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff is Josh Gruenbaum, who is on the board of Peace and who is responsible for pushing through the Jared Kushner plan for effectively labor camps rather than concentration camps, labor camps for the Jewbaification of Gaza and the creating of a free trade zone and making it an integral part of the India Middle East Economic Corridor, etc. Right now, he's being brought into Ukrainian discussions when I think today was the trilateral meeting was scheduled between Ukraine, Russia, and Trump's delegation, and they bring him in. So clearly he's being brought in to do the same thing about Ukraine, orchestrate Trump's plans in Ukraine, make concessions to Putin on his territorial gains, et cetera, et cetera. So the crossover is very clear now for me. And the fact, if just one last thing on the Board of Peace, we should look at the countries that have not been invited. Russia and China have been invited, but who has not been invited? Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, Venezuela, Cuba, Yemen, Colombia. It's as clear as day. And if Trump is trying to create some kind of parallel technocratic institution parallel to the UN to take control of effectively world machinations and economic gain and resource grab, control of sea routes, control of water, all of this, which is what he appears to be doing. The countries that have not been invited have either already been destabilized and colonized to a degree, or are going to be targeted for that. And as someone said to me here yesterday, now what they have to do, they can't control us. They can't bring us to heel. Look at what happened in Gaza. Hamas is still in existence. It hasn't disarmed. It's refusing to disarm. So ultimately, they're going to have to kill all of us, which of course is an impossibility. And I think finally, my one point of optimism is they're accelerating and they're overreaching and overextending.
Yeah, I definitely see the overextending part because it's happening so fast that we can barely keep up.
Yeah.
I mean, it hasn't stopped. It's only the third
Yeah.
the third week of January. I mean, this is
I
I was like, wow, like I thought, this year maybe things maybe there'll be a miracle and things will start slowing down. Oh no, both on a personal and like on a world level, things have just gone from just bad to like worse in terms of like just so many things going on. And everything you said, I want to reiterate something about Kirill Dmitriev, because Kirill Dmitriev has been pretty upfront about how much he admires the Trumps and the Trump family, including Jared Kushner. Because as you mentioned, there was that meeting between the United States and Russia, but he called them the peacemakers, Stephen Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Josh Gruenbaum. He called them the peacemakers, and he's not. I don't think he's lying. This is what he genuinely thinks about them. This is his personal feelings. The guy is on X. I'm not out here. He is on X, putting all of this stuff out, and people could go read it for themselves. This is a guy, one of Putin's top advisors. And as Vanessa said, I've seen the same thing when it comes to high level officials or governments. They always have, there is one way or another, somehow they end up being advised by the worst people, the people that are pushing them to reconcile with the West, the people that are pushing them to pretty much, give up on some sort of sovereignty and autonomy. And I worry about everything that I've seen happen. And as much as, even when it comes to Venezuela, as I think Venezuela, they have something that is extremely intrinsic in the Bolivarianism and Chavismo. I still worry about the fact that the United States is having conversations with them, because I have never seen the United States be allowed in a country and that country come out better than it was before, or survive. And then there's hope that that will happen someday, but based on everything I've seen in the last few years, I that hope has dwindled for me in those terms. Just
Yeah.
realistically and what I've seen, right? I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm not saying that there isn't going to be pushback, that there aren't plans in place, but I don't believe in 5D chess, and I certainly don't believe that there is some sort of benevolence from Washington, that Washington isn't planning on a complete
No, there's
takeover
not.
of the entire sector of Latin America, because they are. And
Yeah.
and as you mentioned, Venezuela is key for this to happen. And this year, since I'm in Latin America, we have an election in Colombia, we have an election in Peru, we
Yeah.
have an election
Yeah.
in forget where else, or somewhere else in Brazil. So Lula's on his way out. Petro's on his way out. Those are, I mean, that's what's left pretty much in Latin America in terms of resistance, like any sort of opposition to anything, and not even as great as Venezuela. But that's it. And then pretty much everything else is captured. So I mean, you have the Peruvians have a lot of Chinese influence when it comes to, there's the port of Chang'e, which I want to look more into, is this gigantic port built by China that the United States wasn't happy um, about seeing when Anthony Blinken came over a couple years ago, and he was trying to kind of figure out what was going on with China. But then you have the United States pretty much embedded in every facet. So, I mean, and I think in that you see the difference of between what is an anti-hegemonic opposition and what is simply competition for capital and competition for resource extraction, which is what we're seeing. And for the people that wanted Russia to be this entity that was going to oppose the United States, what they're showing right now is they have, at the very least, the people that are making the decisions right now do not have that desire. They have the desire to normalize relations. And I think we were right when we called it the age of normalization, because that's literally all I'm seeing right now. And unfortunately, you know, we happen to be correct, and it's not going in the favor of anybody but the people, the very just psychopathic elite that are in power. And as this is all happening, by the way, you have Davos, to which Trump attended. Trump, the anti-globalist, the guy that was going to take down the deep state, was very happy at Davos. And Davos, where they're talking about digital, pretty much what is happening is they're building digital prisons, and they're building this digital technocratic world is coming along with everything you're seeing, and it's happening along with everything you're seeing, because, as Vanessa said, they can't possibly kill everybody, but they can make it illegal for you to protest. And I don't know if you saw, but we've seen the journalist from Germany who has a Turkish descent, and there's another journalist that is Swedish, and they've also been entirely not just debanked or demonetized, but they've been completely pushed out of the EU, of the ability to live, to buy food, to receive donations, to survive. They can't feed their families. I mean, this is what they're going to essentially implement in Gaza. That is the actual goal of this word of peace. And that is also a basis for what else is going to be implemented pretty much everywhere else. And as all of these negotiations for peace are happening, that is also what's being promoted at Davos, this digital currency. And the BlackRock CEO, Larry Fink, was talking about this at Davos. Meanwhile, you have these morons in the United States who still think Trump is playing, like, you know, WWGAA seventh dimensional chess, like, and thinking that he's going to somehow take down these people, in the same way that I think some people think that Putin is entirely independent of the oligarch class in Russia, which he is not. that he did get out. He did get rid of a lot of them when he first came in, and I do think that
Mm.
there's this argument about Putin, like, initially people thought that he was the guy that they didn't want, but there's that belief that no, he was the guy that the oligarchs did want, but then he turned on them. Whatever the case may be, just like Putin, just like Trump, just like pretty much every other world leader, they're not alone in the decisions they make. There is
No,
an
absolutely
elite
not.
class that is, pushing and pulling and manipulating things. And it's not to say that we are powerless, because there's clear opposition to that. There's clear desire to fight, to resist, to oppose. But that it's there, it's there. And none of these people are immune to that power, to everything that we're not seeing. What we're seeing is only but a tip of the iceberg of what is happening
Yeah.
actually behind the scenes, which is scary
Mm.
to think about too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think it was last Sunday I actually was very privileged to be able to have a conversation with the foreign minister of the Ansarullah government in Sana'a in Yemen, so in northern Yemen. But it's a coalition government. It's not only Ansarullah is the resistance movement, so it's not only the Houthis. It's an entire coalition resistance movement focused very much as its core policy on the liberation of Palestine, of course. And, I asked a number of questions. And at the end, I basically said, how does Yemen, in the sense of Ansarullah, and by the way, their entire policy and vision is to have a unified Yemen, while, of course, Washington, the UK, Israel in particular would far rather through Saudi Arabia, and that's why the war began in 2015. One of the reasons is because Saudi Arabia was intending to carve Yemen up into 6 sectarian statelets so that it could effectively, standard procedure, basically just what we're seeing rolling out in Syria and across the West Asia region. To keep it under control and in a constant kind of sectarian state of festering conflict, right? And effectively, so their vision is to have a unified Yemen, even north and south, because before the south had been succeeded from the north and so on. He said, no, we don't accept that. Ultimately, Yemen will be one state with a coalition government, etc. And so I asked him about BRICS. I said, how does Yemen, how do you perceive BRICS in relation to Yemen as a resistance country with a focus on Palestine and the freedom of the peoples of the region? And he said, we don't really consider them. As far as we're concerned, they're infiltrated. If you look at the majority of the countries within BRICS, they're all under the influence of the United States or Israel.
Yeah.
And he pretty much included Russia and China in that. He was more diplomatic about Russia and China for obvious reasons, because to a degree, like Iran is dependent upon Russia and China to buy its oil and so on. At the same time, Russia and China are benefiting because of that dependency. So they're receiving resources at lower prices. That's how it works. Right? But it was amazing how clear-sighted Yemen was about it, and how lacking in that clear sight are many commentators, as we've said before. And we were talking before we came on, this isn't another BRICS bashing session, but it's a part of it's a part of the new world order, and you can't avoid talking about it, because it's no longer about what the US is doing or what Britain is doing or what XYZ is doing, because ultimately that billionaire complex are all to some degree working together, or at least benefiting from the strategy of the other to actually infiltrate and embed themselves within whatever new modification of world order is happening. So everyone is vying for position now. So whether Russia It could even be that Russia is saying, well, let's put ourselves on the board of peace because effectively all countries except free peoples have been invited to join. So we don't really want to be left out. But that's what I'm saying. That's what multipolarity is becoming. It's becoming, there's still a dominant power, which is drawing them in, enticing, incentivizing, threatening, intimidating countries to join it one way or the other, right? And I think, yes, I agree with you about Venezuela, and I know we've had conversations about this, but to a degree, what can they do? No one's going to come to their help. No one. Not Russia, not China. It remains to be seen what happens with Cuba, because Trump is now threatening Cuba, of course, and they're cutting off Venezuelan oil supply to Cuba, which is going to be devastating. I'm more interested to see what Venezuela does about that, because the partnership between Venezuela and Cuba is something incredibly historically ingrained in both countries. So that, for me, is going to be the tipping point more than conversations with the CIA or the US. That's on a par with getting President Maduro back, in my opinion. So that is, for me, going to be, the point at which you might see Venezuela say, that's the red line. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to mention was if they do that, then I think the people that have been saying, oh, they're captured, that's it, they're done, that they've been entirely infiltrated and controlled by the United States, they're going to have a leg up, because Cuba, as you said, that relationship goes back decades, and it's not just a relationship where, we support, it's not just like the relationship between even Russia and China, where you have this, very cooperative, we're going to work on economic bilateral relations, blah, blah, blah. It's actually like tangible.
It's an
we are willing to die for each other. Yeah, we're going to put boots on the ground, that sort of thing. And it's a revolutionary type of relationship where there's this brotherhood that they understand what they've had to go through. And if Venezuela stops giving oil to Cuba, which is already at a deficit, completely devastated by COVID, and because it was so dependent on the tourism, and I've been there recently, and it is completely devastated. There were long lines. It's also unfortunately been devastated by multiple hurricanes and multiple storms that also have hit the island. An explosion in a gas explosion in its one of its main areas. And so if Venezuela were to cut off oil supply, that's it. How will they survive? I mean, they're pretty much dependent on that, largely, very much so. And it would essentially be putting a knife in them, essentially. So for me, it's impossible for them to do that. And if they do that, that tells me more than anything else where Venezuela's
That's
at.
what I'm saying.
And I hope that doesn't happen.
That's the litmus paper, meeting with Trump officials, CIA. That, it's, to a degree, I can understand that and appreciate it. But how they strategize going forward to defend, as you said, an ideological ally, a historical ideological ally. And I don't think Venezuela or the Bolivarian movement is one to abandon those allies. So I think, that could definitely be the tipping point, depending on what happens going forward. And also, of course, bringing back President Maduro and Cilia. Do you say Cilia or Cilia Flores?
I say Celia.
Oh, okay.
I want to ask you, circling back now, since we made our way around to Iran. I am worried about what's happening there, but I'm also worried about how always Israel and the U.S. contingent, they always attack, not proxies, but proximities close to Iran, right? They always go after Hezbollah. They always go after other resistance factions. do you see that happening in terms of right now, in terms of what the potential
Yeah.
against Iran is? Do you see that escalating, maybe perhaps where you are, before we
Oh, it
see an
has. Yeah.
actual attempt?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it's no coincidence that Giuliani and the HTS forces suddenly attacked the SDF, and Israel and the US stood down. They didn't come to the aid of the Kurdish Contras. And now, of course, what's happening, you're seeing massacres of Kurdish civilians in those areas that the SDF, backed by Washington and Israel, had taken over. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the Kurdish Contras played a role in bringing about the fall of Syria, because they were sitting on the oil resources, the agricultural resources, and actually depriving the Syrian people and the rest of Syria from those resources at the behest of Washington and Israel. And they were also, making serious profits from it, just as ISIS had done previously. And now you've seen really the mass release, the opening of I think in Al Hol, there's something like 35,000 family members of ISIS, including some of the leaders, some of the fighters, and so on, have all been released. Some of the biggest prisons have now been broken into and released. And of course, it's not as if that isn't standard US policy also. They did the same thing in Iraq previously. I mean, this is what they do, right? When Giuliani swept to Damascus, he opened all the prisons and basically allowed what were effectively Salafists and Wahhabi fighters, criminals. I mean, whatever you think about President Assad, there were real criminals in the prisons in Syria, right? And all of those were just let out into society. So, of course, that breaks down the fabric of society. It's lawless. There's no system. There's no control. People are stealing from everyone because those criminals were released back into society. And so you've seen the release of ISIS. I think yesterday CENTCOM put out a statement saying that they were going to transfer the ISIS fighters to secure holding bases in Iraq, in different areas of Iraq. So it's very clear. And, the military advisor, Thani, who replaced Qasem Soleimani, has been preparing for this. I'm not really too worried about what's happening in Iraq, because I think the resistance forces there, they already beat back ISIS back in 2016 in Mosul and so on. They've already had this fight, so they're prepared for it, and they've been preparing for it. It depends whether the US is then going to get involved with bombing ISIS and, of course, bombing the resistance positions. That's probably a bigger threat to some degree. I don't think those ISIS Takfiri elements are going to be released into Lebanon. I think they're more likely to try and trigger the existing Takfiri cells here in Lebanon. So in the north, in some in the south, in the Palestinian refugee camps where they've infiltrated, some in the kind of central eastern areas on the border with Syria. But I don't think they're going to try and actually invade here. But what they might try to do is to weaken certain points, or to distract the armed forces, the Lebanese armed forces and Hezbollah, to different fronts, to spread them out more thinly, while Israel then, as it is doing, is escalating its strikes across the country, actually, in the last 2 days. So that, for me, is a signal something's coming in Iran, because they've been targeting really hard in the last 2 days. And funnily enough, now the government has put out a notice saying they will arrest anyone, or they'll pursue anyone who criticizes the president in Lebanon, which, as we were saying today, well, that's the majority of the population. So, but so clearly there is and they arrested, I think, 3 prominent journalists yesterday, and there were protests about that today. So, yeah, it seems that definitely there is escalation ongoing. They've been very quiet in Yemen, having, of course, recognized Somaliland, which means that Israel will be able to expand its reach in the coastal areas and the Horn of Africa, facing Yemen and try and get control of the Red Sea to prevent Ansarullah, creating the blockade on the Red Sea. So yes, for sure, for me, that's preparation for what's coming against Iran, to ensure that the resistance factions are kept busy fighting in their own territory and are not able to target US bases, for example, in the region.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, this is classic too, as to what,
Yeah.
what the US has done. And now we absolutely do have to look at things beyond just the US,
Yeah.
UK, West. And you
Mm.
still hear, for example, Russia talk about that. So the West, but who's actually opposing the West, and is it about the West anymore? Is it
Mm.
it's more so about these global wars, these four transactions for resources. And I think, we could talk about this endlessly because there's just so
Mm.
much going on. But I think that was a good introduction. What is it, like crash course in the last 3 weeks of the first month of the year 2026, which is insane. We're here. We're still alive. There's no asteroid, no alien invasion yet. That has
Not
saved
yet.
us, unfortunately. Not yet. We're still hoping,
And
perhaps.
apparently, I was reading something tonight on X. Apparently, if we stay alive until 2030, they're going to have the technology to keep us alive forever. Frankly, for me, that's one good reason to check out before 2030. But
No, Vanessa, you're stuck here forever with the rest of us. Come on. Oh,
oh, no.
God. I don't know. Not coming
Oh,
back.
but
But
yeah, no.
yeah, guys, I know we both have to go today, but again, we'll be picking right back up. It's been a trying month. So we're happy to be back
Yeah.
and happy to be discussing so many things that I think maybe many of you are also feeling this uncertainty,
Mm.
but just know, like, there's more of us. I've been seeing more messages of of
Yeah,
that, of
definitely.
seeing through the BS and stuff. So yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for joining us on this journey.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, we'll see you next time on Critical Perspectives. Take care.
Take care. Bye.